I'm going to start over. Not that it's very important, but 200 years ago, the evil, dire wraiths threatened the peace-loving planet Galador. In their homeworld's darkest hour, 1,000 brave young Galadorians sacrificed humanity itself to become cyborg warriors, a last desperate line of defense. Though hopelessly outnumbered, these space knights triumphed and pursued the remnants of the Wraith horde across the universe. Now alone in the enemy's mightiest stronghold on a backwater planet called Earth, one Galadorian warrior faces his most awesome challenge. Stan Lee presents the greatest of the space knights, Rom. Maybe I should put the music behind it.
There you go.
But so welcome everyone back to Never Stay Dead. We nearly died that time, but we're back. I am Damian, and I am here with my good buddy Matt. Hi, Matt.
Hello, Rom Lover Unit 1.
Read-only memory.
Yeah. What?
That sounds technical. Let's use that as a name.
That's really what it feels like.
So tonight we are discussing Rom Spaceknight.
Issues 1 through 10.
Issues 1 through 10. You don't have to read them closely.
Not through 75.
There's 75 issues total. So the amazing thing about Rom is that it was based on a toy. The toy only lasted 1 year. The comic book, I think it only lasted 1 year. The comic book lasted about 6 or 7 years?
I mean, it'd have to be at least, it's probably closer to 8. Right?
Yeah.
Because that's 75 issues.
75 issues.
Yeah. So yeah, the toy was a real oddity. It was by Parker Brothers, who does
it was their
board
first
games.
Toy. They're a board
first
game.
And only. And they wanted to start a toy line, but instead of doing a toy line, they did one toy, and then they went to Marvel, I guess, to, instead of a cartoon, do a comic to build hype and do all that. Though this predates a lot of the G.I. Joe and Ninja Turtles and all that would create that formula.
There was a point at which it was illegal to do cartoons that were toys.
Oh, that's right. There's some Reagan.
And Ronald Reagan changed the laws. And since this started in 1979, Ronald Reagan was just running for president at the time.
But before the toy came out, Parker Brothers really scrapped it down, because the idea was that it was going to be this really cool toy and that's how it would sell. But then they brought down the points of articulation, just kind of brought it down. So it's really just this robot that you can move 2 points on the arms and then the legs. And then you could hit some buttons on it. It made some sounds, and you can go out and get one for
a lot of money, I think.
For a collector's item, $50.
There's for those watching on video, there's an ad in the comic for Rom the toy.
Yep.
But it's a very simple design. I feel sorry for the comic book artists having to work with it, right? The hands look like mittens, and there's no face. There's just eyes inside a box.
I love how too the eyes are kind of in the middle there, which makes it look a little more dopey. And they moved the eyes up on the comic, which makes it look a little more statuesque. And there's just a lot of little subtle things they did before it even hit the comic to make it look cooler. And I wonder if that's closer to what the original toy looked like.
Yeah. I can't, if you look on Wikipedia, you can see a picture of the original toy. I don't have it handy right now.
Whatever. It looks very similar to the comic.
Well, that looks much more dynamic, I think.
Well, this is Frank Miller.
But by anybody. The toy is just this stiff little thing. I think they thought they would maybe connect with the whole Star Wars droids or something, I'm guessing.
Yes, that was a big part of it. And the other thing too was Bill Mantlo, the author, had success already, I'm sure, which was part of the pitch with Micronauts doing
Had the
another
Micronauts
Twilight.
already come out? It must have
The
been very
comic had, at
close.
least. I have no
Right,
idea
no,
about the toy line.
had the Micronauts comic
Mhm.
come out? Okay.
Yeah,
I wasn't sure when that first came out.
fair enough. Which is funny because they are forever tied. And I remember IDW not too long ago did like Rom and the Micronauts as
Oh,
a
wow. They got the rights to both.
series. I mean, woohoo.
Well, it probably didn't cost much, as you're implying.
Hot ticket items. I'd almost be surprised if Marvel didn't buy Rom back at this point, just because of the history, just to make a movie, because
They should.
they're
And then
running
they
out of
can
IP.
put him back in the Marvel universe, because he was, as Marvel did back then with their licensed characters, he was included as part of the Marvel universe.
Yeah, he dealt with Power Man and Iron Fist, the Fantastic Four,
The
the
X-Men.
X-Men. There's actually a really big moment for Rogue when she was still with the Brotherhood within these issues.
Mhm. That's the
Spider-Man.
most expensive, hardest to find issue besides issue 1. is the
Well,
one
I
where
have
Rogue
them
appears.
all. I haven't
Well,
read.
I got it
many.
too, but I had to pay a little
Oh,
more, and it was
oh,
a bit
good on
harder
you.
to find.
Sorry, I don't know why I bought the entire run, and now I'm like, why? I don't know.
Well,
I
you
had
can
half
sell,
of it.
you can sell it to me.
Ooh, yeah, a lot of
So,
cool stuff. Jack of Hearts shows up.
which is also a Bill Manilow creation, and
So
without you, we did Eric and I did an episode on Jack of Hearts, and a lot of this the writing style here reminds me of Jack of Hearts.
that
Only
makes
Jack
sense.
of Hearts, thankfully, I'm being cruel, but Jack of Hearts was only 4 issues, and Rom just goes on forever. So I think it brings out the worst in Bill Mantelow's writing style. As he has to kind of spread out all his ideas.
It was funny coming off of a lot of earlier X books and Bill Mantlo being a part of that, having done parts and a bit of them actually, and some of his Spider-Man work, which came after. But I was kind of excited to really dig in, and then I got here, and I wouldn't say this is his best work.
Right. Well, I would say personally, there's a lot of good stuff in here, and I wish someone could rewrite it all.
I think if ever there was a property where there's an opportunity for that, this might be one of them. Because so the setup is this.
Yes.
This cyborg crash lands on Earth, and then he starts scanning people, which looks very threatening.
Right.
And then
a bright ray shoots at you as he scans you.
Yeah. He finds this one lady, chooses that, she's just a normal inhabitant of this planet, and then scans to another group, and then he just looks like he vaporizes 2 of them.
Right.
Which suddenly becomes a national issue. So we find out very quickly this cyborg is Rom. What a shock. And then he is looking for these aliens, kind of like you read earlier, the dire wraiths, who did something bad to his planet, attacked it. They never quite give you all the details there, which I want to come back to.
Yeah. I think the implication is they had kind of a galactic civilization, maybe. And they started attacking because we get flashbacks throughout these 10 issues. And so by filling in the gaps, I think what happened, at first they just talk about the planet Galador, but I think Galador had a lot of planets, because later they talk about a planet that had Galadorians on it that was destroyed by the Wraiths. I think the Wraiths came into this peaceful little galactic or interstellar empire and started just destroying everybody. For what the dire wraiths' motivation for, just maybe they then populate the planets themselves, it's not clear.
Well, so that was a big problem for me reading these first few issues. So just to say, we're looking at this page for those just listening, where the header of this page is The Legend of the Space Knights, which is introed by Rom being like, you wonder what I'm doing, let me tell you a story of, and then it's like him finishing a sentence, the legend of the Space Knights. Like this
Right.
thing's written so corny.
But this is classic Stan Lee era
Yes.
a backstory that he would do for Galactus or for the Silver Surfer or whomever. In fact, it has a lot of echoes of the Silver Surfer, right? This guy who sacrifices himself to save his planet, loses his humanity to fight some larger evil.
Right.
But in this case, it's his own world that is basically puts people's brains inside robot bodies to fight the dire wraiths.
Right.
Because that's the best way to fight people with both magic and science and who are totally evil.
Right. Though what's interesting is we find out Rom's, was it neuralizer?
Neutralizer.
Neutralizer.
Which is the most powerful weapon ever. But what it does is, oh, sorry, you were going to say.
Oh, whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's not though. It's a teleporter. It's
Right.
It's basically putting them to the Phantom Zone.
It sends them to the Phantom Zone. What do they call it? Not quite the Phantom Zone. But
yeah, the Phantom Realm or something.
Right. But oddly, it leaves behind ashy body. So
yeah,
it totally looks like those people have been fried, been murdered, and vaporized, inflamed.
Well, and interestingly, a few issues after where we stop, it's brought up that the thing has a kill setting. So these are supposed to be peaceful people. I just, it's odd. There's a lot of things that are kind of at odds.
Tons of inconsistencies, I'll grant you that. But I still think it's a really fun comic book pulp sci-fi setup.
Well, so
and one of the great things is the dire wraiths are shapeshifters. Mm-hmm. They've infiltrated Earth all over the place. And Rom comes in, this giant weird robot, zapping people, leaving behind ashes. And so, of course, no one believes he's killing evil people. He's killing, or evil creatures. He's killing human beings. And eventually the girl, Brandy Clark, comes to believe him and gets some evidence. And her boyfriend, everyone thinks she's crazy. And her boyfriend doesn't believe her. But then eventually he gets some evidence. And then it's just Brandy and Steve, the only two who believe him. So it kind of has an invasion of the body snatchers vibe in there.
It does.
Who do you trust? Who is real and who isn't?
But they do make a point earlier that some of those dire wraiths have been amongst the human population for as long as these people can remember. These are people they know and relate to every day. Right. And they've been dire wraiths the entire time, which for the first few issues had me thinking like, well, we know Rom's story. What's the dire wraith story? Because I thought it was going to be these like two civilizations that were at war over like a huge misunderstanding or, some contrivance like that. No, they're just evil.
They're totally evil. Yeah, there's no... and like I said, I have yet to parse out what their motivation is, even for destroying planets.
Right.
So it's kind of an odd mix of, because it was a toy and they sort of thinking it's for little kids of just pure good and evil, but all these different kind of things going on in that whole kind of paranoia. And of course, Rom is consistently stupid and not understanding. Hey, I told you these are aliens. Why don't you believe me? As he shoots people and burns them up that everybody has known all their lives.
Right, which for the greatest warrior of some great galactic race,
been fighting for 100 years, you would think he would have a lot of experiences.
And then 200 in deep stasis, just getting from point A to point B to Earth or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, he's incredibly dense.
But that's part of the gimmick that drives it forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they kind of, every issue or two, they throw something new at him, right? Pretty early on, they find this criminal whose name sounds vaguely familiar to me, Archie Stryker. Isn't there a Stryker in the whole X-Men thing?
Yeah, he's one of the Sentinel or the strikers are
one of the
related
creators
to
of the
Sentinels.
Sentinels, or the politician and the Sentinels. Anyway, Archie Stryker gets tricked by the dire wraiths to have his head kind of implanted inside a Space Knight outfit and fights against Rom. And then I forget what was next. They have to fight the hellhounds of the Dark Nebula, which are some kind of dogs that then turn into some kind of humanoid looking creatures who attack.
And the issue 4, the Archie who's
With
put
Archie
inside that
Stryker,
suit,
who's called Firefall.
Right. His suit is supposed to rival Rom's.
Yes.
But
the second greatest warrior's suit. And it was his best friend back on Galador who had that suit.
But the guy gets stuck in it, of course, but he doesn't know that, and it's supposed to be this huge parallel or whatever, but it just is kind of like, well, yeah, you knew that, right? Like,
well, yeah, I mean, he is kind of dense, and it's odd because he's a bank robber, but he has this passion for destroying this alien, because this alien Rom kills people, and he's seen him kill people, or he thinks he has, because what he really was doing was banishing them to the Phantom Zone.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, it feels like there's supposed to be some morality idea in there, but I just, it didn't come through for me.
Yeah, I mean, the Stryker thing seemed very, very forced. A lot of stuff in here seems forced, I guess. Right. And then they get attacked by Thornoids, which I guess are plants that attack, alien plants with thorns that attack and kill. And then it ends up killing one of their friends who's a police officer.
Mm.
And then after that, there's a creature called Serpentine who's hunting the wraiths also.
Yep. And a giant lizard man.
A giant lizard, the last of his kind. Apparently his kind had appeared in an issue of Ms. Marvel, and now they wiped them out.
Well, that was a very interesting thing. Anything they wanted to use in Rom, Marvel was very diligent to introduce in another comic first, because this was a licensed book. So that means if they had something and they brought it in, it was still Marvel's and they could play with it. But if they introduced it in Rom, it was then part of the Rom license.
So does the Rom license own this other this Firefall guy?
I believe so. Yeah.
And all these other things, which I think are probably creations of Bill Mantlo, like the Hellhounds and stuff. I mean, to me, it's just packed with these cheesy space opera kind of ideas. Mm-hmm. There's also something called the Death Wing. It's some uncontrollable evil that the dire wraiths will unleash. But if it doesn't attack their enemy, it might attack the dire wraiths themselves. And they also use it to punish their own members, I guess.
Well, and eventually you find out between the dire wraiths, there's the males and the females. And the males are the science-minded ones, and the females are the magic user ones using this chaos magic. And yeah.
Oh, I missed that. Well, there's a scientist named Rachel Sweet who's a woman.
Yeah. It's not fully introduced until way later.
You've read ahead.
Well, I read about it.
Oh, you read about it.
I read some cliff notes to help.
There's another episode where there's a living house, a magical living house, which is a demon that Doctor Strange has fought before, apparently.
Right. Which the Rom's companions are struggling with, and so Rom has to deal with that as a way that to connect him to them. What's very interesting is like every issue has like a plot point and then a point for the greater serialization.
Right.
And so there's kind of like 2 or 3 real beats in every issue, but every issue is like a peck along the whole. And I really wonder how far they knew they were going to have, because this series really feels like they knew they had time to settle it.
Or maybe by setting it up this way, at any point you could end it in an issue or two, right? You would just suddenly say, well, that's the end of the journey. Like, it's kind of a journey to battle the dire wraiths, and in each step there's something new that Rom has to deal with.
That's true.
In a way, it's this kind of plotting reminds me, and I believe they got it from comics, of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where each season would have a big bad that Buffy ultimately had to defeat. But along the way, there were lots of little other adventures that inched you a little bit closer to the big bad, but weren't always about the big bad or tangential to the big bad.
Yeah.
And now serialized television and comics that have a long-term story are more common. I think this was a little bit unusual, that Bill Mantlo kind of probably found himself in an unusual position where he didn't have the usual superhero story, and he was trying to tell a sci-fi story of, body snatcher type story, but didn't know how many issues he'd have for it. Right. I'm wondering, as you go along, if he builds up the mythology or the mythos of both the Dire Wraiths and the Galadorians. Detail.
They do. That was something that also threw me off. The Galadorians are referred to several times as humans.
Right. In fact, in that very thing, the intro thing that I read, they say he gave up his humanity. Mm-hmm. So in the mind of these comic book writers, people on other planets somehow have evolved exactly like us and are humans.
Yeah, that threw me
if they're
for
good
a while.
Guys.
Right.
And so I guess even I don't know to what extent Stan Lee thought this, but even the Silver Surfer was basically a human until he became the Silver Surfer.
Right.
Norrin Rad. But so I like this format, and it suddenly I kind of poked fun at myself, because you may remember when we read Death Note, I complained about a stretched out story. And that's basically what this is, right?
Yeah.
It's an endlessly stretched out story. The goalposts are just moved further and further away, depending on how many more issues they had. So they did this for 75 issues, I assume. But it's written much more poorly than Death Note. And there's just a lot of... So while it moves along slowly, there's a lot of verbiage and repetition and emphasizing and re-emphasizing of the little emotional points.
Yeah, it's... I know a lot of people now really buck at a lot of these older comics, and to a certain degree, just the amount of words on the page, but also how much the words are like reiterating the art, or it's not the most cohesive storytelling.
Right.
And I've seen it on some older Spider-Man, and I don't mind it so much there. I've seen on essentially a lot of Claremont, and I don't mind it there because that's doing a lot of different things usually. But here and like on Marvel Team Up or something, it's really kind of painful to get through because it is just the worst example of some of that.
Was a lot of that Marvel Team Up written by Bill Mantlo also?
I mean, some of it's definitely other people.
Right.
It was just the time and how a lot of these comics were. And what's funny to me is like, you kind of learn like there's certain panels or certain bubbles, and you learn to just skim some of them and then read other parts, and then it becomes more enjoyable because you're just kind of skipping past the parts that are the weakest.
Because we were going to do a podcast on this, I felt like I should read every word, but I think by issue 3 or 4 I started skipping a large majority of the whatchamacallem, not the panels, the caption boxes, and to a certain amount, the thought bubbles, because you just, after a while, you get that rhythm of, this is going to repeat something that you already know.
And then I think it was by issue 7, I noticed the lettering dramatically changed. It got a lot bigger.
There was one issue where the regular letterer was out sick, and
Mm.
everybody in the bullpen
Bullpen?
filled in for him. I think it might be 8. I'm not sure. Oh, but you're right. Even with this is another one in issue 8. It's definitely bigger lettering. I can't find. There's one issue where the lettering varied in size by page by page.
Okay.
And I'm trying to find that issue, but I can't because the letterer was out sick and at the or had an illness, and at the last minute, just different members of the bullpen filled in. Now, for me, a lot of my copies were smudgy and hard to read, which added to that pain of reading the caption boxes.
And they're not reprinted anywhere.
No, yeah. So one thought as I was reading it is I would really love this reprinted on modern paper. And 2, I really kind of wish Chris Claremont was writing it instead of Bill Mantlo. Because, yeah, they both do the same kind of basic formula, but Chris Claremont somehow makes it all come together, and Bill Manilow kind of makes it all into a bit of a mess.
Well, I'd argue,
at least based on these issues.
Well, if you compare Uncanny X-Men kind of in the meat of the Claremont original era, and then versus this, which is also Bill Mantelow's kind of indulgent comic that he got to go on for a while. Like I said, Bill, every issue, has these points, and it's like this piece of a greater whole. Claremont, when he had more of his druthers in control, really wanted to make every issue or 2 issues their own little section that was moving one character somewhere. And so Rom is plot based. Mm-hmm. X-Men was character based. And so it's a very different push and pull.
It has the potential of all this sort of tapestry of characters between the various dire wraiths and the humans and Rom himself and his backstory. It's not that close to the X-Men, but I feel like 1979 X-Men and this have a lot of use a lot of similar techniques.
Yes,
but this one is just being done for the paycheck, and Chris Claremont was in love with his characters and what he was doing with his story.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
but I guess Bill Manilow probably was a bit in love with just all the sci-fi pulpiness here.
I feel like it's a very different idea and flex, and I've heard and specifically listened to people who really enjoy Rom, because this is not what to me, this is a lot of like what people are telling you comics are schmaltzy kind of low-end literature or whatever. This is a lot more what they're thinking,
but I was loving the schmaltz. I mean, I was loving all the cheesy ideas like the hellhounds and the thorn plants and the haunted the house that is actually a demon, and the evil dire wraiths that are shapeshifters and have infiltrated our society and stuff. And I was loving the concept that people were constantly misunderstanding what Rom was doing. It was done though at that, like, people misunderstanding Rom or Rom's stupidity and not setting it up so that people would understand why he's doing what he's doing.
I think there's a
very childish, I guess.
There's a lot of fun ideas in here, and you can see some of where it's going, but I wish there's a little more tension rather than going the Saturday morning cartoon route of making the dire wraiths just the bad guys,
right?
And making the government, like this, like, well, they just don't get wrong. This was very of a kind of a thing, and it had so much potential to be more. And that's not to say that I was trying to say, like, there are so many fans of this that love it for what it is and how it's presented.
Right.
And this is just a big, great, very soft sci-fi space opera.
Yeah. And I love it for what it is, but not for how it's presented.
Okay, yeah.
And so, I kind of, by the end of issue 10, I was kind of eager to read more, because I will read it kind of in that skimming kind of way that we talked about, but looking for it to develop some of these ideas. Now, if I got to issue 25 and it still kind of threw away every idea without following up on it, I think I might give up at that point, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's hard to say.
Well, and another weird thing about this book that I find interesting is how much of the talent is tied to Spider-Man, because you have Bill Mantlo, who had a big long run with Spectacular. You have
he did.
Sal,
I didn't realize that.
who
Sal,
had,
of course, had a very long run on.
right, and then later, do you know who the secondary main artist is after Sal?
Yes, Steve Ditko.
Right.
Which is mind-blowing. Steve Ditko coming back to Marvel and basically doing what was probably a very low on the totem pole comic book.
Well, and that I'm sure was just for the paycheck.
Yes. And I haven't really peeked ahead at the issues I do have with Ditko, but I remember those issues from the 80s and picking up the occasional Rom and being very disappointed in Ditko's drawings. But maybe I'll view it differently now. I don't know. But that whole period in the 80s where he came back to Marvel, almost everything he did seemed to be just for the paycheck. Because we know that he did not lose his drawing skills, because we can see them still there in his self-published work in the 2000s. Mm-hmm. Not his writing skills, but maybe it's his drawing skills.
Well, did he ever really have writing skills? Like, is there anything?
Well, he was the plotter of most of those Spider-Man stories, so he had some kind of skills.
My understanding is he had like a growing say towards the end of the run, but like especially the first, like through like the Master Planner saga was mostly Lee, and then.
Well, I know at some point he was credited as plotter.
Right. And
which implies
mix and blend, and
he just came in. He didn't even discuss a story with Stan Lee, because if they discussed it, Stan would have taken credit. So he must have just come in with some pages and then Stan put the dialogue on them.
Yeah, it's one of those famous rivalries in comics, and at this point I'm like, I don't know where one ended and the other began, but the more I look through the work of like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and some other Stan Lee collaborators, and then seeing their work without Stan Lee, right. Stan Lee's contributions became more obvious.
Yes.
So, okay.
Yes, I'm not one to say that it was all Ditko and Kirby.
Right. Going back to Rom though, if you could have the rehash of Rom now, who would be your team? Who would you want to in the book?
Interesting. I think I'd like Javier Fernandez, who I've just been reading on the Defenders.
Okay.
Have you seen those Defenders?
Maybe a couple covers, but Defenders is not on my list.
Nearby me. The Defenders have a very retro look to them right now. Hang on a second. I'm just going to grab the... I just did a video where I reviewed all the comics I read this week, including the Defenders. So it's here somewhere. There's Javier Rodriguez. The color is very wild, but the drawing style is very reminiscent of Silver and Bronze Age.
That reminds me a lot of who am I thinking of? Oh, he's on Daredevil for a while. Why am I spacing this?
Chris Samney.
Yes.
It's a more gonzo than Chris Samney, I would say.
That's fair.
With wilder panel page layouts than Samney. Samney is a master. I love Samney's work. Mm-hmm. I think in a way Samney would be too good for Rom. You need something cheesy, I think.
Okay.
I'm not putting Fernandez down. I mean, too sort of fine arty for Rom. And Fernandez, to me, seems very good at this kind of pulp explosion here. But who to write it? Maybe just someone like Donny Cates or something, or or Tom Taylor or someone like that. Just sort of a solid, pulpy comic book writer.
I wouldn't want Donny Cates because I wouldn't want that like darkest twist feel brought into it.
Yeah. He always has to push things into the darker edges, I guess.
Yeah.
Although his Thor, I'm kind of thinking of his Thor, and I don't know if you're reading that.
I am, and to me that like especially bringing back the old Secret Identity.
Don Blake.
Yeah, that whole thing that felt very darkest twist to me.
I guess so, yeah. Well, I don't know who would write it. Maybe I would write it.
I mean, if you want Cates, you want Cates. That's my
no. I was just trying to think of who could do a basic story and not screw it up. Like Matt Fraction or someone would just get too fancy with it.
That's true.
Like you just want it. I just want it to be kind of pure pulp.
What about like Wade?
Mark Wade? Yeah. I don't know if he can.
It does. It feels a little.
Mark Wade's a bit controlled.
Okay.
He could do fine. He would do a fine job with it.
Okay.
But he wants to be a little bit refined. I mean, he's a comic book writer, but he wants to be a little bit refined about it.
Yeah.
If I wanted a more refined writer doing it, maybe Kurt Busiek, but he would turn it into something completely different.
Yeah.
But he would understand all the pulp tropes and everything. Anyway, I'm the one who kind of forced this upon you, but you had already bought all the issues.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to sell them to me, I mean, I guess now I have maybe half the issues, but I do, for whatever reason, want to own them all.
I don't know. I feel like I should read it through once before I part with it.
I guess. I mean, if you're not enjoying it.
It's hard to part with a full run like that. I don't know.
That's true. We're run collectors. We're not obsessed by key issues. We're obsessed by runs.
Did you get any of the annuals?
No, I missed the knowledge of it. Well, I got a Conan that was the 300th issue, but I don't think it was an annual, but it was like an annual. What annuals were there?
There's 4 annuals. Just
Oh, you mean the annuals of Rom? I thought we were moving on to talking about other comics.
Oh yeah, no, I was talking about
I have 2 of the annuals sitting in my box.
And then also, if you want to be a real ROM collector, the most recent Cable run referred to the Space Knights pretty heavily in the middle of that run.
Oh, really? I wonder if Marvel owns the Space Knights, but not Rom himself.
I guess.
Because I think they did. I think in later issues they made up a bunch of Space Knights, and I think there was a mini series about the Space Knights in general.
Huh? Yeah, probably. That's funny.
But back then, like you were mentioning, Marvel Team Up. I had the sense when I was reading them, even though as a kid I loved Marvel Team Up, that Marvel Team Up and certain other books were the writers just knowing this was not an important Marvel book, and they were not putting their best foot forward the way they were when they were writing Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four or the Avengers or other things. That the Team Up books and things like Rom and the Micronauts and the like were kind of just toss-offs. Even though all comics were toss-offs back then.
I mean, there's a few good Marvel Team Up issues, but most of them are Claremont or DeMatteis. DeMatteis, sorry. Yeah. So.
Right. Well, good stuff comes out even when there's no one caring whether it's good or not.
Well, I think in Claremont's case, it was a rare time for him to play around with characters he didn't normally get to play with.
Mm-hmm.
And then in JM's case, I think it was him proving his chops to try to get onto a bigger book.
Yeah.
Which is more of what they should have done with Team Up, I think. Give it to someone who's hungry rather than give it to someone as like their D-list assignment.
Well, and some people have the ethos of the hack writer, and they're proud of it. You know, I can take any assignment, I can turn in a passable story within a short amount of time and get my paycheck. And I don't think Chris Claremont had that kind of mentality, but I'm sure a lot of I've known other kinds of writers with that mentality. They're very proud of it. It's a skill, I guess.
I mean, have you ever read Clandestine?
No. Is that by Claremont?
Yeah.
Was he hacking it out, or was he just no longer any good?
I mean, what lies in a man's heart? I don't know. It was not very good, and he did better before and after. So,
I was thinking of our show, Never Stay Dead, because I read this week Khazar, Lord of the Savage Land, where he's coming back from the dead on the cover. I had no idea he had died, and apparently his wife, Shanna the She-Devil, had died too. But then in the comic, they're already alive, and there's no explanation of either their death or their rebirth, except they now have superpowers. Do you know anything about the death of Khazar?
I'll be honest, Khazar is one of my least favorite Marvel characters, so I don't follow him. Yeah.
I just thought you might know because you read more Marvel than I do.
That's fair, but no, I missed this. Though this comic looks pretty cool. I really like the art.
The art in here is incredible, and it's not a bad written comic. So I was very pleasantly surprised. Really good coloring and art. But so next time, this was basically my choice, my fault. Next time it will be your fault when we read The Longbow Hunters by Mike Grell.
Yeah, with some very adult content, so no minors allowed.
Oh, really? That adult? Okay. I have not read it yet. I have downloaded it on Comixology.
All right.
Even though I used to be a Mike Grell fan, I just never believed I would like a Green Arrow story.
What else did he do?
Oh, no.
I've only ever seen his name associated with Green Arrow.
Well, he was a superstar at DC with a comic called Warlord, which he wrote and drew for years.
Oh, okay.
And it was maybe one of the only comics of the DC explosion/implosion era that survived.
Okay.
And then he left. He was an early adopter to indie comics, and he left to do two well-known series at, I want to say, Pacific and Eclipse Comics. One was called Star Slayer, which now is most famous for having the first appearance of Dan Stevens' Rocketeer. And the other was called Sable. And those were major indie comics at the time. And then after those, so he kind of grew up doing those. And then he came back to DC and did the Longbow Hunters. And actually, even before that, he was a bit of a star on his work on the Legion of Superheroes. Before Warlord, he was most well known for the Legion of Superheroes.
Huh. All right.
And he did with Denny O'Neil, he did a run on Green Arrow, Green Lantern, actually somewhere in the mix of his first period of time at DC.
Cool. All right.
So there you go. Old man knowledge.
I've seen Sable around, but I never picked it up. So that
right.
A lot of that tracks. Warlord wouldn't be something I'd pick up.
Yes, Warlord is like Khazar, so it would not be.
I thought he was more like Conan.
Well, he's somewhere between Conan and Khazar, I suppose. He lives in a lost land where there's still dinosaurs.
Oh, okay.
But there's also sorcerers there.
Okay.
And he was a Vietnam pilot who crash landed in this lost land in the Antarctic, which is, isn't that where Khazar's Savage Land is too?
Sounds about right. Yeah. All right.
Okay, well, Khazar came back from the dead. We will come back from the dead yet again, at least one more time, to discuss the longbow hunters.
Sounds like
And Matt
stuff.
can keep twisting my arm maybe. So, goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.